Geography shows that. It's a sad day for Galilee. And even in this case where they bring him this man, and we don't know why he was in Bethsaida, but he was there to teach his disciples. They were with him when he went there. Public ministry was over. Somebody knew he was there, and they brought this man. But there will be no more public ministry. And so he takes the man out of the village, isolates him. Do you remember that he said back in verse 12 when they said, we want a sign from heaven? In verse 11, he said, truly no sign will be given this generation. This people, I'm done with signs. I've done enough. You don't need any more. So even the geography is important as he moves to the fringe, and from there he's gone. There's even a literary shift here as well. This miracle really is the beginning of the second act of Mark's historical drama. Act 1 is Jesus' public ministry with the people. Act 2 is Jesus' private ministry with the disciples. Act 3 is Jesus' passion. Okay? So we are entering into his private ministry. A final private miracle launches his private time with the disciples, and from there, he with them goes to Caesarea Philippi and back down through Galilee with no public ministry. It's time for the training of his disciples. Some writers have said this is such a significant point historically that it could be called the continental divide of the Gospel of Mark. Everything before this is leading up to it, and everything after this falls from it. And the real peak of the continental divide is chapter 8, verses 27 to 30, the next passage, the one we'll look at next week, where Peter says, you are the Christ. That is the pinnacle confession. No human being has said that in Mark yet. Demons have said it. Demons have said, we know you're the Holy One of God. But that confession hasn't come out of the lips of any human being yet. It becomes the pinnacle confession. Chapter 8, verses 27 to 30. And that confession indicates the true conversion of the apostles, their salvation, and then their training is launched in seriousness, right on up to the Passion of Christ, which is the third and final act. So that's the setting in which this little miracle appears. It brings the Galilean ministry to an end, and it starts the private ministry of Jesus with his disciples. Now let's look at the story. That's the setting. Look at the story. And it has the feel of an eyewitness account. That should not surprise us. You say, well, John Mark wouldn't have been there. No, of course not. He wasn't one of the apostles, nor one of the early disciples of Jesus. He came later. How does this then become an eyewitness account? Who was John Mark's mentor? John was writing his gospel to Romans in the city of Rome under the influence and as his source of Peter. Peter was his source. So Peter, who was from the town of Bethsaida, would have been familiar with it, became the source of this to Mark. So it does have eyewitness connections. Let's go to verse 22. They came to Bethsaida, which means house of fishing. And that, by the way, was near where Jesus fed the 5,000 men plus women and children, right? Recorded back in chapter 6, verses 33 to 34, maybe 20 to 25,000 people. He created fish and bread for them. Remember that? That happened near there. Now, a miracle of feeding 25,000 people would be well known to the local town. And many of the people in that local town would have been fed in that meal. They are very, very familiar with Jesus. Very familiar. One other thing to note, that place here is called in verse 23, village, the village. The village. But Luke 9:10 refers to it as a city, a polis. Was it a village or was it a city? Well, the answer is that it became a city. It had always been a village. It became a city because Herod Philip wanted to enhance it, enlarge it, develop it, and he did that. He engaged in some development of Bethsaida. That's when he named it after the daughter of Augustus Caesar, and it developed into a town. But it had always been a village, and if this is an eyewitness account, and Peter is the eyewitness, it probably would have been known to him and his family before him as the village of Bethsaida. A village, its sentimental name, its familiar name; a town, its new identity. It is not far from Capernaum, to the east of Capernaum. The miracles that Jesus did at Capernaum spread to Nazareth, which was further west than Bethsaida was east. So whatever Jesus was doing, wherever he was doing it, the word was all over everywhere. In fact, the truth of the matter is, Bethsaida had high exposure to Jesus and his miracle power. And so Jesus shows up in town. You say, well, wouldn't he try to keep quiet? But remember, this is Peter's hometown, this is Andrew's hometown, this is Philip's hometown, and hometown boys would see their family, and the word would get out that Jesus is there. And some local people then bring a blind man to Jesus. They know he heals everybody and everything. And they implored him to touch him. And I just want to comment on this. Jesus healed by touching people, and you have to understand that they were untouchable. The religious establishment wouldn't touch people like this. Cursed people, ceremonially unclean, unsynagogued people. But Jesus just violated that conventional approach. And it's really a wonderful thing to see this, if you go back to chapter 1, because it characterized all his healing. Simon's mother-in-law was sick with a fever, and they spoke to Jesus about it, so he came to her. Verse 31, he raised her up, taking her by the hand. Down in verse 40, a leper comes to Jesus, falls on his knees, says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I'm willing, be cleaned. You don't touch people. You don't touch lepers, for sure. Jesus touched these people. Chapter 3, verse 10, he healed many, with the result that all those who had afflictions pressed around him in order to touch him. He became identified as somebody who healed by touch. And people claimed